The night air in Charlotte carried the faint hum of electricity as the city's Lynx Blue Line light rail glided smoothly along its tracks. Commuters shifted in their seats, tired faces lit by the cold glow of overhead lights. For many, it was just another ride home. But for one young woman, this would be the last journey of her life. August 22, 2025. The clock had just crossed evening rush hour. People stepped inside the East-West Boulevard station, unaware that tragedy was waiting only moments away. Security cameras blinked silently in the corners, recording every move, every sound, every breath. Among the passengers was Iryna Zarutska, a 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee who had come to America seeking nothing more than safety and opportunity. She sat quietly, her hands folded, her eyes carrying both exhaustion and hope. It had been a long day of classes and work, but home was just a short ride away. For Iryna, this train was supposed to be the bridge between her struggles and a few hours of peace. But shadows often walk among us unnoticed. Sitting just a few seats away was Decarlos Brown Jr., a 34-year-old man whose presence would soon shatter the silence. No one could have known what he carried in his pocket, or what violent thoughts had taken root in his mind. To every other passenger, he was just another stranger on the evening train. To Iryna, he would soon become the face of horror. The train rattled forward, its mechanical rhythm echoing like a heartbeat in the tunnel. Passengers scrolled through phones, whispered into earbuds, or stared blankly at the floor. The city outside flashed by in blurs of neon and shadow. Then, without warning, the stillness cracked. Brown stood up, his movements sharp, almost unnatural. In an instant, a knife gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Before anyone could react, he lunged toward Iryna. The blade cut through the air, striking her once, twice, and then again, each thrust fueled with brutal precision. One blow pierced her neck, and the life she had fought so hard to rebuild began to slip away. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. Someone shouted for help. Passengers scrambled, their voices trembling, their feet pounding against the train floor as panic filled the air. Iryna fell, her body trembling, her breath faltering. She tried to fight for life, her eyes wide with shock and pain. She had survived war, escaped bombs and destruction, only to meet violence here, in the very place she believed would protect her. Outside, the train screeched to a halt. Emergency alarms blared. Within minutes, police officers stormed the carriage, weapons drawn, ordering passengers to step back. They overpowered Brown, forcing him to the ground, his knife clattering against the floor. Handcuffs snapped shut, but the damage was done. For Iryna, there was no second chance. Paramedics rushed in, kneeling beside her, their hands pressing desperately to stop the bleeding. But the wounds were too deep. Within moments, Charlotte lost a daughter it never truly got to know. The CCTV footage captured everything: the sudden attack, the chaos, the helpless attempts to save her. When released to the public, it shocked the world. Viewers who watched the grainy video saw not just a crime, but the extinguishing of a young life that had already endured too much suffering. News spread rapidly. A 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee killed on a Charlotte light rail. The suspect arrested on the spot. First-degree murder charges filed. But behind the headlines was something more than just another crime story. This was the tale of a girl who had fled war, crossed oceans, and worked tirelessly to build a better life. It was the story of a dream cut short, of hope crushed under the weight of senseless violence. And it began long before that night on the train, because to truly understand who Iryna Zarutska was, to see her not as a victim frozen in a news clip, but as a daughter, a friend, a dreamer, we must go back to the beginning, to Ukraine, to her childhood, to the roots of a life that promised so much, and to the cruel twist of fate that took it all away. Long before the flashing lights of police cars in Charlotte, long before the fear of a knife in a crowded train, there was a small town in Ukraine where a little girl once dreamed of a brighter future. Her name was Iryna Zarutska. She was born into a land of contrasts, Ukraine, a country of golden wheat fields that swayed under the summer sun, of churches with blue domes that kissed the sky, and of people whose resilience was carved by centuries of struggle. To grow up Ukrainian was to grow up knowing hardship and hope walked side by side. From the very start, Iryna was different. Family and neighbors remembered her as a child with bright, curious eyes, the kind of eyes that asked questions even when her lips stayed quiet. She wanted to know how things worked, why the stars shined, what stories were hidden in the old streets of her town. Books became her closest friends, and her teachers often said that she wasn't just studying to pass exams, she was searching for meaning. At school, she was not the loudest student, nor the one always in the spotlight. Instead, she was determined, quietly competitive, and deeply kind. Friends often recalled how she would share her lunch with classmates who had none, or stay late to help someone solve a math problem. She believed knowledge should never be hoarded. It was meant to be shared, like sunlight warming every corner of the earth. Her parents, ordinary working-class Ukrainians, raised her with discipline and tenderness. Her mother often reminded her, "Education is your passport, Iryna. The world may try to close doors, but knowledge will always open them again." Her father, a man hardened by labor but softened by her daughter's smile, taught her courage. When she fell from her bicycle as a little girl, he picked her up and said, "You don't stop because you're hurt. You stop only when you're finished." Those words would echo years later when life tested her in unimaginable ways. Like many young Ukrainians, she grew up with dreams that stretched beyond the horizon of her small town. She wanted to see the world, to study abroad, to carve her name into something greater. Maybe medicine, maybe law, maybe something that would let her stand between the vulnerable and the dangers of life. But dreams in Ukraine were never safe. Even before the war, life was fragile. Political tensions, economic struggles, and the shadow of Russia always loomed nearby. Still, Iryna held on to her ambitions with both hands because she believed in the power of persistence. In her teenage years, she developed a love for languages. English was not just a subject in school, it was a key that could unlock the wider world. She practiced late at night, listening to YouTube lectures, repeating phrases into the mirror, writing down words on scraps of paper. She promised herself, "One day I'll speak this language so fluently that no one will know I wasn't born with it." Outside of academics, she was like any other young woman, laughing with friends, listening to music, taking long walks through tree-lined streets. But there was always something deeper in her gaze, as though she already knew that her life would not be ordinary, that fate was quietly weaving a complicated tapestry for her. Her friends admired her determination. One of them once said, "Iryna wasn't just planning a life, she was building it step by step, even when none of us could see where those steps would lead. She believed in tomorrow more than anyone I knew." By the time she reached her early 20s, the future seemed both close and distant. Ukraine was struggling, but she believed her country and she herself had resilience in their veins. She wanted to study, to travel, to grow into someone who could make a difference. But then came 2022, the year when the sound of dreams was drowned out by the thunder of war. Bombs, sirens, blackouts, fear. The girl from Ukraine, who once looked at books as her doorway to the world, would soon be forced to look at war-torn streets and ask herself the most painful question of all. Should I stay, or should I leave everything I know behind? The answer would send her thousands of miles away into a land she had never seen, where she would chase survival instead of ambition. And yet through it all, she never let go of that quiet fire in her heart, the fire of a dreamer who refused to surrender.
The year was 2022, and winter in Ukraine carried more than just the cold. It carried whispers of war. At first, people dismissed them. Russia won't dare, some said. This is politics, not reality, others insisted. But on the morning of February 24th, the whispers turned into fire. The world awoke to the sound of explosions. Sirens howled across Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and countless small towns that had never imagined they would be battlegrounds. Apartment windows shattered. Streets that once echoed with laughter now thundered with tanks. And in the middle of it all was Iryna Zarutska, a young woman whose life was about to change forever. She had grown up learning about wars in history books, never imagining that one day she would hear the whistling of missiles above her own roof. That morning, as the ground shook and neighbors rushed into basements, she felt the thin line between normal life and chaos dissolve in seconds. Her parents tried to reassure her, "It will pass, stay calm." But as days turned into weeks, it became clear this was not a storm that would blow over. This was an invasion. This was survival. Shops closed, electricity cut out. Schools and universities shut down. Iryna's books gathered dust while she spent nights in bomb shelters, clutching her phone as messages from friends rolled in. "Are you safe? Where are you?" Every day brought news of another town captured, another life lost, another dream destroyed. She would later tell a friend that the hardest part wasn't the bombs, it was the silence after. The silence of knowing that life had been interrupted, that their generation would never be the same again. For weeks she wrestled with the question, should I leave? To leave meant abandoning her home, her friends, her memories. It meant admitting that the land she loved could no longer protect her. But to stay meant gambling with death. Her mother's words came back to her. Education is your passport. But what good was a passport if the airport runways were burning? At last, the decision was made. She packed a single suitcase, some clothes, a few books, a photograph of her family, and joined the river of refugees heading west. Buses, trains, endless waiting lines. She became part of the haunting images the world saw on the news. Mothers holding babies, children clutching toys, students carrying backpacks that now held not textbooks, but survival kits. The journey out of Ukraine was long and heavy. Iryna described it once to a friend as a blur of cold stations and crowded buses, where everyone's eyes looked the same, tired, frightened, but holding on. When she crossed a border into Poland, she felt both relief and heartbreak. She was alive, but she had left a piece of herself behind. The streets of her childhood, the voice of her grandmother, the little park where she used to sit with books, these were now trapped in a war zone. From Poland, she searched for a new beginning. Humanitarian organizations, refugee programs, and support groups guided her. She applied for asylum in the United States, hoping that across the ocean she might find not just safety, but a chance to continue her education. The process was slow, but she didn't give up. And when she finally boarded a flight, her first ever airplane journey, she pressed her forehead against the small oval window and watched Ukraine shrink below her. Tears blurred her vision. She whispered a promise, "I will return one day, stronger." When the plane landed in Charlotte, North Carolina, everything felt foreign. The wide highways, the bright supermarkets, the language buzzing everywhere around her. She was thousands of miles from home, but she carried Ukraine in her heart. Here, she was not just Iryna Zarutska. She was a refugee, a student, a survivor. She would have to start from zero. And yet, as she stood at the airport with her suitcase in hand, she made herself another silent vow. If I escaped bombs, if I escaped war, then I will survive anything, even here, even now. But fate is a cruel storyteller, because while Iryna thought she had left danger behind, destiny had already written another chapter, one not of bombs or missiles, but of something more personal, more intimate, and far more shocking.
Every refugee carries two stories, the one they left behind and the one they are writing now. For Iryna Zarutska, both stories revealed the same truth. She was a fighter, not with fists or weapons, but with courage, resilience, and an unshakable belief that she could build a better tomorrow. In Charlotte, people began to notice her quiet strength. She was not the type to dominate conversations or draw attention to herself, but her presence was magnetic. Professors admired her diligence. Classmates admired her discipline. Employers often said the same thing. She works harder than anyone else. She doesn't complain. She just does what needs to be done. But what truly defined Iryna was not how much she endured. It was how much she gave. Despite juggling studies and jobs, she found time to volunteer. She translated documents for other Ukrainian refugees who couldn't speak English, guided them through bus routes, and even helped families apply for assistance. She knew what it meant to be lost in a foreign country, and she refused to let others walk that road alone. Her generosity wasn't showy. It was subtle, almost invisible, like the warmth of sunlight through a window. A classmate once remembered how, on the day of an important exam, Iryna noticed a nervous student struggling with last-minute revisions. She sat down quietly, explained a few concepts, and encouraged her. That student later passed the test and said, "Iryna believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." She had a way of making people feel seen. Perhaps it came from her own wounds, from knowing how it felt to be invisible in a crowd, another face in a refugee line. Perhaps it was simply who she was. Even in her hardest moments, she carried herself with dignity. Some nights, after long shifts of cleaning offices, she would walk home under the soft glow of streetlights. Her body ached, her shoes worn thin, but her head remained high. She often reminded herself of the words she had written in her journal, "Uphill leads to the sky." To her, every hardship was part of a climb, slow, painful, but upward. Yet beneath her strength lay vulnerability. Friends who knew her well spoke of her loneliness. She missed Ukraine fiercely, the smell of bread from local bakeries, the laughter of cousins, the rhythm of her native language filling the air. There were nights when she cried quietly, afraid that she might never see her homeland at peace again. But even her sadness had a kind of bravery. She allowed herself to grieve, but she never allowed grief to paralyze her. Instead, she transformed it into drive. Each exam she passed, each paycheck she earned, each small victory was her way of saying to the world, "You didn't break me. I'm still here." And Iryna dreamed. She dreamed of a career where she could stand for others, the vulnerable, the displaced, the voiceless. She often told her professors she wanted to work in humanitarian aid or international law. Having lived through the consequences of war, she wanted to ensure no one else felt abandoned by the world. Those who met her in America were struck by her resilience. She was young, but she carried the wisdom of someone twice her age. Life had forced her to grow up quickly. War had taken her childhood. Exile had taken her comfort. But nothing had taken her will to fight for something better. One of her friends once said, "She could have been bitter. She could have hated the world for what it did to her, but she didn't. She chose kindness. That was her rebellion." And that was the paradox of Iryna Zarutska, a girl shaped by war, yet determined to spread peace, a student burdened by survival, yet eager to help others survive, a refugee carrying scars, yet refusing to let those scars define her. By the summer of 2025, she had begun to feel a fragile stability in Charlotte. She balanced school and work with increasing confidence. She spoke English fluently enough to hold conversations without hesitation. She was saving money, planning for the future, daring to imagine a life where she didn't just survive, but thrive. She often rode the light rail after class, a book tucked under her arm or headphones in her ears. It was part of her routine, part of the life she was carefully building. She never imagined that the very same train, the place she had come to trust as ordinary and safe, would one day betray her. Because even fighters, no matter how strong, cannot always see the battle waiting around the corner.
August 22, 2025. The morning sun rose over Charlotte like any other day. For the city, it was routine. People rushing to work, children heading to school, traffic lights blinking red and green. But for Iryna Zarutska, this day would be her last chapter. She woke early, as she always did. Her small apartment was modest, just a bed, a desk, a few shelves stacked with books. On the wall hung a single photo of her family back in Ukraine, a reminder of everything she had left behind. She whispered a quiet prayer in her native language, asking for strength, asking for another day of purpose. Classes filled her morning. She took careful notes, raising her hand when asked, her accent still noticeable, but her confidence stronger than ever. She stayed late to review her work, determined to succeed. A classmate recalled later, she was focused that day, like she always was. No one imagined it was the last time we'd see her smile. In the afternoon, she worked a short shift at her part-time job. She folded uniforms, cleaned tables, spoke politely with customers. She was tired, but that was nothing new. Fatigue had been her shadow ever since she left Ukraine. As evening approached, she made her way to the Lynx Blue Line light rail. This was her daily route home, a train she had boarded dozens of times before. It was ordinary, safe, unremarkable. She had no reason to fear. Inside the train, she found a seat near the middle. She carried her bag, placed it on her lap, and stared out the window. The city blurred by in streaks of neon and dusk. Passengers shuffled in and out, lost in their own worlds. Some scrolled on phones, others spoke softly. And then he boarded. Decarlos Brown Jr., 34 years old. To the casual eye, he was just another man on the evening train. But hidden in his pocket was a knife, and within him was something darker, a storm no one else could see. He sat nearby, silent, watching. The train pulled forward, its wheels screeching against the rails. For a moment, everything was calm. Iryna adjusted her seat, her mind already drifting to tomorrow's assignments, her plans for the weekend, maybe a call to her family back home. And then the silence shattered. Decarlos Brown rose suddenly, his movements sharp. Before anyone could react, he drew the knife. Gasps echoed through the carriage, passengers froze, and then he struck. The blade flashed under the harsh fluorescent lights, once, twice, again, each thrust more brutal than the last. Screams filled the air as panic erupted. Iryna tried to move, tried to resist, but the attack was relentless. One blow pierced her neck. Her hands reached instinctively to stop the bleeding, her eyes wide with terror. She collapsed, her body trembling, her breath growing shallow. The girl who had fled bombs, who had crossed oceans, who had survived everything life had thrown at her, was now slipping away on an ordinary train in America. Passengers screamed for help. Someone pulled the emergency cord. The train screeched to a halt. Within minutes, police officers stormed inside, weapons drawn, ordering Brown to the ground. He dropped the knife, his eyes blank, his body subdued in seconds. The threat was gone. But for Iryna, time had already run out. Paramedics rushed in, kneeling beside her, their hands pressed desperately against her wounds, their voices urgent, "Stay with us! Stay with us!" But the life was already fading from her eyes. In those final moments, perhaps she thought of her family, her home, her dreams. Perhaps she thought of nothing at all. And then the world lost her. News spread quickly. Ukrainian refugee killed on Charlotte train, suspect charged with first-degree murder. Headlines flashed across televisions, phones, and newspapers. But behind those words was a human life, one filled with courage, sacrifice, and hope. In Ukraine, her family wept. They had sent their daughter across the ocean for safety, believing she would be spared from violence. Now she was gone. In Charlotte, the community mourned. Candles were lit at the train station, flowers piled up near the tracks. Strangers who had never met her cried as though they had lost someone of their own, because in Iryna's story, everyone saw a reflection of something fragile, how fleeting life really is. And in the halls of justice, Brown faced charges of first-degree murder. But no verdict, no sentence could restore what had been taken.
This was not just the story of a crime. It was the story of a young woman who dreamed of peace and found violence once again. She survived war, only to be struck down by senseless hate. Her name was Iryna Zarutska. She was 23 years old. She carried books in her hands, hope in her heart, and the weight of two worlds on her shoulders. Her story reminds us that life is fragile, that violence knows no borders, and that behind every headline is a soul with dreams and memories. Tonight, as we remember her, we must ask ourselves, how many more lives must be lost before we learn the value of compassion, of safety, of peace? Because for Iryna, the final ride came too soon.